This is the tale of two tomatoes, told in two chapters. The first, the tomato you know, red, ripe, and round, the industrial tomato. And how it gets from the farm and onto your plate is a long story.
It's pretty complicated to get a tomato all the way to your plate. And there's a lot of steps along the way, there's a lot of choices to be made, and a lot of different labor that goes into making it happen. The first step is to pick the right seed to plant. For industrial tomatoes, it's often about finding the variety that'll ripen really evenly, be durable. So you pick a seed, you plant it in a greenhouse, and it'll either be prepared for transplanting at about 5 or 6 weeks, or it'll be raised entirely in a greenhouse.
Greenhouses are great. The sun shines in, warming the plants and air inside. The roof and walls trap some of that heat, while the rest escapes at night. About half of our tomatoes eaten in the United States are greenhouse grown. But to maintain the perfect temperature to grow tomatoes, you need lots of heating and cooling, and that takes energy. Sidebar, much of our energy comes from fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, and oil. Burning them creates carbon dioxide, a naturally occurring and very important, wait for it, greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases in our planet's atmosphere trap the sun's heat, kind of like our tomatoes' greenhouse, and keep things nice and warm. But too much greenhouse gas in our planet's heating and cooling system doesn't work as well. Sidebar over. So growing tomatoes takes energy, in the greenhouse or out.
If you're going to put it outside, you got to prepare the soil, so fertilizer, pH, other soil amendments, get it ready. Plant it in the ground, stake it so it can get ready to get tall. So it'll be growing, going along. Often it'll be sprayed for pests, so that could be more herbicide, it can be pesticide for fungus, insects, bacteria. Eventually, it's ready for harvest, so it's picked, often by hand, sometimes by machine, depending on what kind of tomato and where you are. Before it goes around the country, it'll get ripened, usually artificially, so they pump in ethylene gas to make them ripen more evenly and ship them across the country. They'll get to the grocery store, you go to the store, take them, bring them home, cook and eat.
Phew, that's a long journey for a tiny tomato. Now the distance the tomato travels to get to you matters, but how it travels matters most.
So I live in Washington, D.C., and food can come by boat through the Atlantic Ocean, and it's actually relatively low emissions compared to shipping it by truck all the way across from California. Let's say a relatively local farmer driving down from New York in his little pickup truck, he might have room for, let's say, 100 pounds of tomatoes in his truck. So he might be driving less miles, but could still have more emissions per tomato than a container ship coming from Mexico. And so longer distances by boat are still more efficient than shorter distances by truck.
This is where we get the phrase food miles, the distance traveled from farm to fork. But most of our tomatoes' greenhouse gas emissions occur during production.
There's a lot of different steps of the tomato that emit greenhouse gases, and the biggest piece is actually during production. And that's mostly due to a couple things. It's due to the fertilizer, and it's due to greenhouse heating and cooling for tomatoes that are grown in greenhouses. So fertilizer has emissions in two ways. The first is that it's basically made from natural gas. You take natural gas, combine it with nitrogen in the air. That's how you make fertilizer. So it takes a lot of energy to produce. Then when you put it on the field, as the field gets wet, some of that fertilizer breaks down and goes back into the air as nitrous oxide. And that's a greenhouse gas 300 times stronger than carbon dioxide.
Now we've just been talking tomatoes. Think about the rest of your food. The average American eats about 2,000 pounds of food a year. So what we eat has a massive impact on our planet's greenhouse.
So trying to think about how to limit the carbon footprint of your food can be overwhelming. There's a lot of information to consider, and even for someone like me who works in the field, I don't always know what to do. The important thing is not to get too focused on being perfect and just be thinking about where your food comes from.
So that's chapter 1, the tomato we know. There are other tomatoes out there though. Next up, chapter 2, the tomato we grow.